Welcome to Leapfrog's webinar on the CAA and quality and post-election update and some insights. And we're looking forward to a really great conversation. I have two fantastic panelists joining me. I'm Leah Binder. I'm the president and CEO of the Leapfrog Group. We are a purchaser-driven nonprofit that drives for change in patient safety and quality in healthcare. And we work with purchasers every day, human resources executives, like many of you, who are interested in structuring their health benefits in a way that gets the very best care for their employees. So we bring purchasers together to figure out how to measure that quality and to get it publicly reported so their employees can use it for their families and getting the best care. So today, we are going to talk about the Consolidated Appropriations Act. And that is an act that was actually signed way back in 2020 by President Trump in his first year in office. In his first, not his first year in office, the end of his first term in office. And but now President Trump will be back. And so the CAA remains a major issue for employers to grapple with and to hopefully use to the benefit of their employees. So today we're going to have two experts to join us in discussing that. We have Amy Gordon. She's a partner with Winston & Strong and advises her clients on their self-funded and insured health plans, wellness programs, and on-site clinics. She is well-versed in ERISA, and that is really what we're going to need to know all about today. And she's going to tell us what's going on with the CAA, because that really was a change to ERISA that enhanced the obligations employers have under ERISA. So we're going to hear from Amy on what's been going on for 4 years. There's been a lot of regulations and some lawsuits and some really key issues and key moments in the history of the CAA in the past 4 years, and we certainly will likely see more of that to come. And then we have James Gelfand, who is president and CEO of the ERISA Industry Committee, ERIC. And he leads the development of ERIC's health policy and advocacy on behalf of their membership of self-funded employers, large employers. And he is also a well-known figure on the Hill, on Capitol Hill. He's in and out offices throughout Congress and probably the White House as well. And he'll tell us, maybe he'll pull out his crystal ball and tell us what's going to happen in terms of policy around the CAA and ERISA. Where do we see it all going? What do employers want to see happen from a policy level with ERISA and with CAA in the next 4 years? So that's who we're going to be talking with, and we're going to be looking forward to your questions as well. And before we get started with Amy and James, I'm going to start with just a little overview to refresh you if you don't recall. But this is part of a series Leapfrog has been doing on the CAA, and all of the resources and the recordings of the prior webinars we've done over the past few years on this are all on our website. But let me just give you a very brief overview of what this is all about, just in case you have forgotten for some reason. We start with the simple fact that employers and purchasers are responsible for ensuring that their employees get cost-effective, high-quality health benefits. They're responsible for that. And that is a legal responsibility. And health plans, which many of us think health plans are the payers, but in fact, often they're getting the funding from these employers. And in many cases, they are just simply passing it through from the employer directly to the provider through claims. A lot of people think that, United Healthcare is paying for your health. That's who's paying for your health care, because that's what the name on the card is. It's actually your employer. Health plans must provide quality of care data, and participants, you, should use this to find the best care. Healthcare quality cannot be assumed to be great every single place you go to. In fact, there's lots of variation, as we have learned over some hard lessons at Leapfrog over our 24-year history. So it is very important for you to shop for your healthcare. And there are now been some high-profile lawsuits and Department of Labor investigations around the CAA, holding employers accountable for these responsibilities. So this is a very serious and increasingly important priority for employers to really put some focus on. Next. So there's a rule that was issued, the Transparency and Coverage Rule related to the CAA, that the quality of healthcare services provided under a group health plan are an important component of value. So value, we like to think of as, I'm sure all of you think of it as, is a combination of getting a good price and getting excellent quality. Combination equals value. But I want you to consider this. In healthcare, certainly, there is no good price for bad care. How much, for instance, what's a good price for you for getting a hospital-acquired infection? What's a good price? There is no good price. There's no good price for a preventable infection, let's say. You want to get good care first and foremost, and then you want to negotiate the price for that. First, you got to make sure you're getting good care. Plan sponsors need to demonstrate diligence in monitoring quality. You have to act in a way that shows you're monitoring quality, which is why it's so helpful that purchasers founded something like Leapfrog, but there's other organizations, but purchasers have really been on the front line of demanding to really know what is the quality and safety of care their employees are getting. And they have worked in very strategic ways, including Leapfrog, to make sure they get their hands on that information. So you should be proud of your heritage as an employer. And now it's time to use that heritage to the benefit of your employees and to keep you in line with the CAA. Next slide. So we have a number of resources for evaluating quality. That again, we're a nonprofit founded by employers, bringing them all together to come up with some toolkits and simple ways for you to evaluate quality and use it to your own benefit and the benefit of your employees. It is purchaser driven, and purchasers for our entire history have really wanted quality to be in the hands of their employees. That's been the goal. So let's work on that together, and hopefully it'll be helpful to you as you navigate this terrain with the CAA. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy Gordon to tell us what is going on with the CAA.
Thank you, Lee. Thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. So on this first slide, it's just really a summary of all the different components of the Consolidated Appropriation Act that Lee just spoke about. And as you can see, a lot of this, like she said, is really involving transparency and disclosure and making sure that users of healthcare and group health plans that sponsor these types of healthcare programs, that they are aware of what they're getting, how much they're paying, and the quality of the care that the participants are receiving. And if we could please move to the next slide. There are a number of upcoming compliance obligations that group health plans will have in the next, I'd say, 30 to 60 days, and then again, beginning in 2026. And I'd like to first start with the gag clause prohibitions. And just as a summary, what the gag clause prohibition is, it's pretty self-explanatory by its name, is that when a group health plan, and this would include an employer-sponsored group health plan, as well as health insurance issuers, when they enter into agreements with third parties, whether that be healthcare providers, networks, associations, when they enter into agreements with these third parties, they need to ensure that information is going to be shared and directly communicated to avoid violating this gag clause prohibition. Now, in addition, each employer that sponsors a group health plan, as well as health insurance issuers, are required to file an attestation form, which you can find on the CMS website, and that is due at the end of this month and every December 31st thereafter, that essentially says, yes, those agreements that we have entered into with third parties, they do not prohibit the sharing of this information. So again, that's an upcoming compliance obligation that you're going to have by the end of this month. Can we please move to the next slide? Thank you. The other obligation that falls under the CAA, and that is giving a number of group health plans, keeping people up at night, I'd say, is the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act non-qualified treatment limitation compliance obligations. And there has been a lot of back and forth on these obligations. The departments have given guidance, and the guidance has changed and the guidance has been expanded. But for the most part, what this is a requirement to demonstrate that there is mental health parity and with respect to mental health care that is in parity with medical surgical care. So again, no additional barriers and no additional hoops to jump through to be able to get that care. And again, this also involves not only mental health, but also addiction treatment. So it seems pretty simple by the way I've just described it, but it is anything but simple. There are a number of different obligations as a group health plan that a sponsor is going to have to demonstrate. And the analyses are very complicated because they involve real-time analyses, which many of the third-party administrators and insurers are not willing to do unless a group health plan is under audit with the Department of Labor. So what we've done to assist clients to get in, close compliance is we've done everything we can short of that real-time actual data, which we've been assured by third-party administrators and PBMs that if an employer group health plan is under audit, they will produce very timely for the department. Now, the time frame on this is very, very short. The department, when group health plans have been audited in the past, they're usually pretty flexible with how long it's going to take to provide disclosure, but not in this situation. It's been a very, very short leash as far as how quickly things need to be turned over to the department. And again, these new rules that were released earlier this year, they are going to go into effect January 1st, 2025. The most critical, I think, on this summary is the new fiduciary certification. That was not in existence prior to this new guidance. And what that is that fiduciaries or plan sponsors, which are fiduciaries, plan administrators, anybody who's a fiduciary under the group health plan, they're going to need to certify that they have engaged in a prudent process, including the selection and monitoring of their vendors who have helped them document this non-qualified treatment limitation analysis. So this is really going to be like any other prudent process, any sort of, prudent steps that you take should be documented in order for you to meet this obligation. And then the certification is going to be something that is going to have to be filed with the department now and then going forward. Can we please move to the next slide? So we believe in general, there's going to be a big shakeup with respect to the department and other regulators' guidance, given the recent U.S. Supreme Court decision in Loper-Bright. And just as a quick summary, everyone has relied on the Chevron doctrine for years. And what that was if the regulators, meaning, Congress and Senate, when they put out any type of guidance, that might be less specific in nature, then it was up to the actual agencies to interpret any ambiguousness or any of the details that were sort of left out of those regulations now or guidance. And we all know that there is usually a lot of liberties with respect to how those rules and regulations have been interpreted over the years. And what the Loper-Bright decision did was it essentially overturned that and said that agencies can no longer have that liberal authority to interpret anything ambiguous or insert those details that have been left out of the rules and regulations. And we're already seeing a number of challenges to existing rules and regulations that the Department of Labor and other regulators have issued in respect to the Loper-Bright outcome. Just a shout out for Eric. Loper-Bright it will definitely impact the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act non-qualified treatment limitation rules. And Eric has already come out in support of group health plans, saying that it would consider all possibilities up to and including litigation to protect those plan sponsors who may be negatively affected by the final rule. So again, I think we have a lot more to see on how Loper-Bright is going to pan out with respect to ongoing guidance and regulations. But with respect to the mental health parity that I mentioned in my earlier slide, we anticipate seeing, a lot of pushback on the department and its most recent guidance. And I'll leave that to James to talk about at the end. Can we please move to the next slide? I also wanted to go over a couple of the litigation trends that we're seeing. And again, this is consistent with what Lee mentioned earlier. The transparency and the fee disclosure is really increasing the plaintiff's bar activity with respect to lawsuits against group health plans. And these are very similar to what we have seen in the past with respect to 401k and retirement plans and the excessive fee cases associated with those. And so just a general overview of those cases, we're seeing some challenges in the prescription drug costs and fees, pharmacy benefit management, selection and oversight. We're also seeing objections to companies' use of prescription drug rebates, and then allegations in general of plan mismanagement with respect to service providers and the way they are negotiating pricing and costs. If we can move to the next slide, I'm going to talk about some specific litigation. And the first case involves Johnson & Johnson. These cases are still ongoing, by the way. Johnson & Johnson was sued over their health plan drug prices. The plaintiff's class is claiming that J&J failed to ensure plan costs were reasonable. They said that J&J's fiduciaries failed to exercise prudence when they selected their pharmacy benefit manager. And they're also claiming that J&J specifically agreed to unfavorable contract terms. They pointed to a specific generic versus specialty drug, showing that a 498% markup, and claiming that this publicly available data was available to the fiduciaries, and therefore they should have done something differently with respect to the PBM agreement and the prices that the plan was paying. I think anybody who negotiates PBM contracts realizes how difficult it is to negotiate specific drug prices with a specific PBM. So this will be very interesting to see how the court finds if they find in favor of the plaintiffs or they find in favor of J&J. I do feel like it does put group health plan sponsors in a precarious position because The PBMs are not that different when it comes to the different pricing and the prices that participants pay for drugs. So I question what if the outcome is in favor of the participants, the plaintiffs, what is a group health plan sponsor to do? You could move to a different PBM, but I'm not exactly sure that would impact the outcome. The next lawsuit, I'm sorry, one more on that page. The next lawsuit I wanted to quickly mention was the Navarro versus Wells Fargo. And this is very similar to the J&J lawsuit. The plaintiffs claim that by reviewing the fees that were reported on the Form 5500, that again, Wells Fargo failed to consider alternative PBMs and alternative pricing models with respect to the pharmacy benefit plan they were offering to participants. So again, both these cases are ongoing, so we're monitoring the outcomes, and likely in the future we'll be providing some guidance on what to do based on those outcomes. Can we please move to the next slide? So a recent win from the group health plan perspective was a MetLife case. But before we celebrate, just want to give you a little overview on what happened there. So MetLife received a rebate from its pharmacy benefit manager, and it kept that rebate. And the plaintiffs in this suit challenged that MetLife had an obligation to not keep that rebate for itself, but rather to use that rebate and distribute it to participants in the plan, or to use it to offset future costs associated with the plan. Now, MetLife won in this situation, but the court, the Third Circuit at least, left open the door for participants to still sue regarding excessive fees and plan mismanagement based on the facts and circumstances of this case. So again, this case only involved the rebates. It did not involve the general overall costs associated with administering the PBM, again, similar to the J&J case. But we will definitely monitor future activities in this realm as well, and provide guidance on what to do, again, depending on the outcomes of those other cases.
Amy, can I ask you a quick question about that?
Absolutely.
When you say MetLife prevailed on that, does that mean that the PBM, the process for awarding the bonuses and stuff like that, like what part of it did they prevail on? Does that mean that we don't have what part of those excess fees did MetLife win on?
Great question, and I should have specified that. So MetLife prevailed on being able to keep the pharmacy benefit manager's rebate that they received associated with the drug utilization that the participants used, and which generated that rebate. The participants argued that they were entitled to a share of that rebate, either in the form of a refund to them or a reduction in the cost of the coverage. And the court said no, because they could not see any direct harm to any of the plaintiffs based on the refund of that rebate to MetLife. So great question. Again, very narrow, very different than the J&J situation, where participants are saying the whole program is just excessive in cost, and that the fiduciaries failed to monitor those PBMs when the PBMs were setting pricing that the participants were paying. So I think it's best to monitor this whole area for best practices and what we can do. But I can't stress enough the need to go through the process and document your procedural prudence in the selection of your service providers, including PBMs, the negotiation of those PBM agreements, because as I said, you cannot dictate to the PBM what they should be paying for X drug and what type of costs the plan would incur with respect to those drugs. You also can't dictate the types of drugs or pharmaceuticals that your participants are going to use. There are different brand names that are associated with different costs, different co-pays. And so that level of decision on the part of the fiduciaries is really out of their control. So the best that fiduciaries can do is really document from a procedural prudence standpoint what is in their realm and what they have done to, potentially lower the costs or to provide quality care and treatment to their participants.
I think that's one of the things I've learned through this series of webinars on CAA is the importance under ERISA. ERISA doesn't require you to succeed in protecting your covered lives from every possible, error or problem or anything. You don't have to succeed all the time, but you have to try. And the effort and documenting that effort is critical for ERISA. If you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A box, which is on the bottom of your screen. We do have a couple of questions. So what we're going to do is quickly, since they are really related to Amy's presentation, I'm going to
just I just typed the link. One of our viewers asked for the link for the compliance obligation for the gag clause.
Right.
So I just added that link, and if anybody is unable to retrieve it, it is it's the title of the communication is Gag Clause Prohibition Compliance Attestation. It was put out by the U.S. Department of Treasury, U.S. Department of Labor, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services on August 2024. So that link will take you right to the attestation instructions and the form. But if you're unable to find it or you're unable to get there through the link, let us know, and we can send you maybe a PDF copy of that annual submission instructions.
And we will post this with the information and the recording of this webinar.
Perfect. And then the second question I see, we're aware of plans, national/state, that have reached out to providers/third parties that have offered to attest on behalf of those third parties, including self-funded customers, based off brief answers to a questionnaire. However, no information is offered by the plan related to contract prices, quality data, etc., to help a self-funded entity govern this decision. Is this a common practice for a plan to attest on behalf of a third party by a plan? I guess it all depends on the level of detail. We have certain third parties that are providing a lot of detail, some that are providing not a lot of detail. It's going to fall on the fiduciaries to actually make that attestation. If you do not feel like you have enough data to do so, I suggest that you ask for more information. But I mean, the other option is if you are absolutely being told, no, this is the best we can do, then you have to essentially make your affirmation based on the information that you've been provided. I would not in any way recommend anybody saying that making any kind of suggestion that the third party meets its obligations. You are meeting your obligation based on what the third party provides you. And so when you are drafting that attestation, my suggestion is that you keep that in mind.
Okay, we have one more question, and we're going to get to that very quickly because I want to get to James and the
Absolutely.
politics of all this.
I hear a lot about documentation for risk of fiduciary purposes, but what should that actually look like? Annual summary of activities, a folder of emails. Again, I feel like there is no perfect recipe for this. I don't think it should be a folder of emails. I think it should be more or less, you requesting the documentation analyzing what you get back. If you feel like somehow it falls short, asking for more documentation. If you're being told, nope, that's not, you're not getting it, or that's the best we can do. Well, I think, again, you have to make your attestation based on the information you've been provided.
And is this the first year that fiduciary attestations have been required?
So the fiduciary attestation under the mental health parity, yes, this is going to be the first year for that. The gag clause, I believe that this is not the first year that that the gag clause certifications. I forget what year that started, but this is not the first year for the gag clause.
Okay, thanks. Let's move on to, we'll get to additional questions. So keep putting your questions in the Q&A box. But let's start with James Galtham. I'd like you to pull out your crystal ball and tell us, post-election, what can we expect from the CAA? What do you want to see happen from the CAA?
Thanks, Leah. Thrilled to be here. For those who are not familiar with the ERISA Industry Committee, we are a trade association that represents large employers on benefits-related issues. And of course, that includes healthcare and healthcare costs and compliance, et cetera. I will note there was another question in the Q&A. I think Amy already answered it, which is that the gag clause attestation and the CAA mental health parity attestations are two different things. You have to attest to both. Yeah. And I'll also say, no one's going to want to hear this because nobody wants to go in and read court documents, but check out the complaint that was filed against J&J. It is really interesting. And if you look at nothing else in there, there is a chart in there that lists the price that the PBM paid for the drug versus the price that the PBM charged the self-insured plan for the drug. Some of the markups in there are insane, like 10,000% for certain drugs. And what's being alleged by the plaintiffs in that case is you should have tried to negotiate with them, right? You should have looked at this and said, there's something wrong with this. This isn't right. And I do think that even if all the PBMs are doing this, it still would be something that you could ask them about and say, we're not comfortable with this. Like, what can you do for us? And at least you could document, well, we had that conversation and we benchmarked. And so you'll probably win the lawsuit. You may still get sued, but at least you could probably win. So with that, happy to go in and talk about what we're expecting legislatively this year and beyond as it pertains particularly to the Consolidated Appropriations Act and all of the interesting and fun provisions that are in there. Now, I'm going to lead by talking about completely different issues because what happens to those CAA issues is going to be almost entirely dependent upon what Congress decides to do in the next couple of weeks in terms of other programs that they want to spend money on. And the reason for that is if you look at the things that are on this page, so preventing a pay cut for physicians who see Medicare patients, funding community health centers, ensuring that telehealth flexibilities implemented during COVID are extended, and funding certain Medicaid and public health programs that expire if not reauthorized and refunded every so often. Each of these things costs money. They will increase the deficit. Congress does not want to overtly increase the deficit. So what they will try to do is to pair these things with policies that lower the deficit so that they can say, yeah, we spent $30 billion, but we also saved $30 billion. And depending on how long they do these policies, maybe they'll only extend them through March of next year. Maybe they'll go through September. Maybe they'll go for 2 years, like many of us have advocated that they do. Congress is going to need somewhere between $5 to $6 billion and $30 to $40 billion. And the size of that number will be entirely dependent on what other policies can ride along. That's what will be the determining factor. So if you could go to my next slide, please. Here are some of the additional policies that could potentially be included in the so-called healthcare sidecar legislation that would be attached to the continuing resolution that is expected in the next 2 weeks to prevent a government shutdown right before Christmas Eve. If Congress takes no action, the government will shut down. And Merry Christmas, federal employees, you're all on furlough for, the government shutdown. They'll put, prevent people from going to national parks, all that fun stuff. Anyways, So what are some of these other provisions that are being talked about? First off, transparency and PBM reform. PBM reform was not included in the Consolidated Appropriations Act because it was removed at the very last minute. But those of you who were following that debate back in 2018 and 2019 will note that the bill that later became the Consolidated Appropriations Act, at least the healthcare portion of it, that bill did include PBM reform. And here we are, 6 years later, Congress is still working on PBM reform. PBM reform measures have moved through 7 different committees in this Congress, and many of these policies are considered cooked. They're considered agreed to, ready to go. It's just a matter of when, not if, they're passed into law. Next, prescription drug patent reforms. So something amazing happened a couple weeks ago, which is that a bill that the pharmaceutical industry hates passed the United States Senate unanimously. Unanimously. This is a bill that was introduced by Senator Cornyn. It was passed through the Judiciary Committee. And what it would do is it would crack down on the ability of pharmaceutical companies to create these so-called patent thickets. If you haven't heard of a patent thicket before, it's not your fault. This is a strategy that's used by big pharma to make it harder for generic drugs to come online and compete with their products. And what they do is they file a zillion patents on the same drug. And so a drug will be patented in Europe, and it will have 3 or 4 patents on it. And then that same drug will be patented in the United States, and it'll have 60, 70 patents on it. Each one of these patents has to be challenged before a generic or biosimilar drug can come online to compete. And each of those patents ends up costing about $1 million to challenge. So you're looking at these small generic drug companies that don't have a whole lot of extra money to spend. When it's going to cost them $200 million to come online, a lot of them just throw up their hands and say, forget it, we're not coming to market, which means we all pay higher drug costs because there's no competition. Next up, high deductible health plans and HSA reforms. That's something that has moved through the House. Republicans are very much in favor of that. Hasn't moved in the Senate, right? So it's a possible something that could be horse traded between the Democrat Senate and the Republican House. I think it's probably more likely to be considered next year when Republicans control both sides of the Capitol and both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue, but it's in the mix. It's something that's being talked about. And then lastly, provisions related to fairness in contracting and honest billing. So that would be a prohibition on certain contractual clauses that hospitals use to get higher prices out of employers, right? So these would be things like anti-tiering and anti-steering provisions, the all or nothing contracts where a hospital system would say, hey, we own 25 hospitals. And if you want one of them in your network, you've got to put all of them in your network. Most favored nation clauses where a hospital will agree with an insurance company, you get the best price, everybody else has to pay more than this. Imputed contractual provisions and contracts with other providers not related to this provider. So that's fairness in contracting. Honest billing, so those who are in health policy world will recognize this as provider identifier numbers, right? So right now, a patient will go and see a provider. The insurance company will be alerted, this patient just, attended received the following services at HCA. Well, HCA is a whole lot of different hospitals and a whole lot of different doctors' offices and providers. And if the patient received this care at a doctor's office, then the doctor should be paid less than if the patient went to the hospital and got this. So having that information, knowing where exactly the site of care was that the patient received care, this would save lots and lots of money. And in fact, the Fairness in Contracting bill, it's passed in the Senate and the House, it's passed on committee level. And it's estimated to save about $5 billion. That patent ticket bill would save about $2 billion. The larger bill that contains the transparency and PBM reform provisions is estimated to save several $1 billion as well. So, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. You're starting to talk about some real money. Let's go to the next slide. I want to talk about transparency and coverage in the hospital transparency rule. As Amy mentioned, and as Leah mentioned, these are rules that were drafted by the Trump administration, but because of recent events, including that Loper-Bright decision in the Supreme Court, these rules are vulnerable, okay? So where did they come from? Well, the Trump administration decided that based upon essentially one line in the Affordable Care Act, which had not been acted on for about a decade, that said providers must post their standard charges. But they would then write several hundred pages of regulations about what exactly had to be disclosed, when it had to be disclosed, in what manner. It would have to be not just necessarily standardized prices, but individualized prices that are charged to different insurance companies, or what's the cash price, etc. In other words, somebody who didn't like these rules very much could say the agency overstepped its authority. And the hospitals have already tried to sue and knock out these rules. They failed, but in part they failed because of Chevron deference, which said that the Department of Labor and HHS and Treasury, when they came up with these rules, they're the experts, right? So we have to trust that they did it right. That doesn't exist anymore because the Loeb were bright. So if the hospitals sued again, maybe they would win. And likewise, the insurance companies and the PBMs actually sued over the transparency and coverage rule. They just did so through the Chamber of Commerce. So it's very likely that these rules could be in jeopardy if they're not codified. Congress knows that, and so Congress is considering codifying them. On the next page, just quickly wanted to mention mental health parity also. So Amy just told you some of the many challenges with the mental health rule that has recently been finalized. I will note that the several hundred pages of rules, which revamped all kinds of aspects of what mental health parity is and how it works, they came at about purportedly as a result of a tiny provision in CAA that basically just said, you know, those limitations that you have in your plan that are non-quantitative, well, they have to be written down and explained somewhere. That's what it says. And from that, they decided to completely reinvent what is mental health parity and how does it work. I think this absolutely exceeds the statutory authority that the agencies have. And if I was the federal government, I would be worried about getting sued. So that's as much as I'll say about that, though. I don't want to tease more about that yet. Let's go to the next page. I want to talk about gag clauses. So yes, you have to report every year. You have to attest. I promise there's no gag clauses in the contracts that we signed this year. Unfortunately, you actually have no idea if there are any gag clauses. And even if you did have an idea, you don't actually have control and the ability to remove some of those gag clauses. We've been working with Congress on this to try to fix that, to close some of these loopholes, to ensure that if there are gag clauses, that they will actually be removed. And there is legislation that has passed the House of Representatives by more than 300 votes. And one of the provisions in there would close those loopholes. So this is something that we think is really important to fix, part of the CAA that right now isn't really working exactly as it was intended to work. And it has a good chance of passage in the coming weeks. Next slide, I want to quickly talk about what is PBM reform that is currently under consideration. There's 5 major provisions that have been talked about that are in some pieces of legislation, not in some pieces of legislation. Like I said, it's gone through 7 different committees. So there's a bunch of different provisions that are ripe and ready to go. It's not clear which ones Congress ultimately would choose to pass into law. But there's a ban on so-called spread pricing, where the self-insured health plan group health plan is charged more money than is actually paid to the pharmacist, right? And the PBM keeps that spread, that arbitrage of the difference. There's a requirement to pass through rebates to the plan sponsor and prevent the PBM or the PBM's offshore group purchasing organization from keeping those rebates and not giving them to the plan. Transparency into PBMs, including into their PBM-owned pharmacies and their GPOs and other entities that they control, that would help employers to be better fiduciaries and better shepherds of the money that go into your group health plans. Policies to potentially de-link PBM profits from the list price of prescription drugs. I think it's much more likely that something like that would be implemented in the Medicare Part D program than in the commercial sector, but it is at least being discussed on Capitol Hill. And then holding PBMs accountable in the same way that plan sponsors are held accountable. In other words, making a PBM a quasi or full fiduciary to the health plan, the same way that the employer is. On my next page, I wanted to share with you, we actually issued an issue brief on that fiduciary provision. So check it out. It's on Eric's website, www.eric.org. But we've been trying to make the case to Congress. A PBM is not just a vendor. They're not just a service provider. They are making critical decisions that determine the cost and the comprehensiveness of your plan. If you are a self-insured plan, even if you're a self-insured plan of the size of the ones that Eric represents, it's unlikely that you are really putting together the formulary and choosing which drugs will be on your plan, which drugs will be on tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, the specialty tier, etc. The PBM is making those decisions, and they're making them based on payments that they get from the drug companies. So we think that there's a very good case to be made that a PBM should be a fiduciary. I think it's unlikely that full fiduciary status goes through in this Congress, even though there have been amendments in committee talking about this, and both the House and the Senate has been in consultation about ways to do this. It's something that's coming down on the horizon, though, and I just wanted to flag it for you. And we've been working on this, like I said, since 2017 and 2018, when committee first passed PBM reform legislation. We think it's time to actually see that happen. If you go to the next page, it's just a summary of what's in the issue brief, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead another slide. Talked a little bit about what we're expecting as a result of the election, right? So the fact that control of the White House and the Senate will change in January will have an effect not only next year, but it will also affect what happens in the next couple of weeks, because there are some who say we need to clear the decks for a new president. We need to make sure that he can focus on other things and we finish our business this year. There are others who say, no, we want to make changes now, that we don't want to make changes now that preclude the new administration and the new Senate from making decisions and being able to
policy. So
Are we having technical difficulties?
sorry, I had a technical difficulty, but everything should be in working order now. Hopefully you can hear me, Leah.
We can hear you now.
Perfect. Okay. So it's go either way. It's going to be a battle, but I just pointed out that the elections have consequences, and not just after the new people take their seats, right? So there are a number of legislators who have already lost their elections. They're not coming back in January, but they are going to still be voting throughout the remainder of December, and they are going to be involved in these debates about what's going to happen in this lame duck session. So let's go to the next slide. I want to quickly mention the main focus next year is going to be on a so-called reconciliation bill. I don't want to talk too much about reconciliation. It is an arcane set of rules that govern how you can pass legislation with a bare majority in the Senate, right? The House already just needs a bare majority to do stuff. But in the Senate, generally you need 60 votes to pass legislation, because everybody has to agree that they're going to stop debate. Otherwise, you'll just debate ad infinitum and never vote on the actual bill. That's not how it works on a reconciliation, but you can have a bill passed with only 50 votes plus the vice president breaking the tie if the things that are in that bill are considered budgetary in nature. And right now, all the questions in DC are about what is budgetary and what is policy. What could the Republicans potentially do in a reconciliation bill next year? The picture that you see on the slide, this is the person who makes that decision. Elizabeth McDonough is the parliamentarian, and she gets to look at legislation and say, this part is budgetary, this part is policy. And what happens is any parts of the policy, they're tossed out. They do not get to be in the bill when the bill ultimately passes. The main focus of the reconciliation bill is going to be extending President Trump's tax cuts, because part of that will expire next year if Congress does not act. But the way it works in DC, when you got a moving vehicle, a must-pass piece of legislation, that's where all the action is. So going on to the next slide, one of the things I wanted to point out that is almost certainly going to be there is that they're going to be looking at the corporate tax rate. They're potentially implement a tax credit, which President Trump has called for caregivers and family caregivers. One of the things that we worry about is that this tax bill is expected to cost between $4 and $6 trillion. And Congress is going to want to offset at least part of that spending. Where are they going to get $4 to $6 trillion? Well, one of the places that they might look would be the exclusion, where the insurance that's provided by an employer to an employee is not taxed as income. Well, they might say, no, we're going to treat part of it as income, or we're going to treat it as income if it's worth X amount of dollars. Those of you who still have scars from the Cadillac tax and that whole debate will recall this policy. It could well come back. One of the things that we hope will be included in a tax bill are improvements to high deductible health plans. So you may be aware that health savings accounts and HDHPs, they are part of the tax code. So a tax bill is what you need if you want to do improvements there. Republicans love these things. So maybe it's time after 20 some years that they will finally update and modernize those accounts. And I listed on the slide some of the things that we hope that they'll do there. On the next slide, here are some of the major policy issues that we believe, if not addressed fully in the lame duck session or at all, will most likely come up next year in terms of healthcare, in part because the Republicans are going to be in control of everything. So Republicans love transparency. They say, we may not want to meddle in private markets, but markets do require transparency to function. So it would make sense that they would support transparency legislation. I mentioned HDHPs and HSAs, hospital and drug prices. Like there's finally an acknowledgement on both sides of the aisle that the reason health insurance costs so much is because healthcare prices are out of control. Right? So if you want people's health insurance and their cost sharing to be lower, you got to lower the prices, which means you got to close some of the loopholes. You got to stop some of the things that drug companies and hospitals are doing that are inflating prices, that are preventing competition. And those things are consistent with a conservative worldview. So therefore, they are acceptable to Republican lawmakers, and therefore they have a chance next year. ACA and other coverage options. The Biden administration worked with Congress to increase the subsidies that are available to people who purchase health insurance on the individual marketplaces. And those subsidies that are going to go back down to what they were. And Republicans are going to be very, I think, they're not going to want to extend those higher subsidies. At the same time, they are going to want to increase options that are available to sort of get around the ACA, right? So that'll be things like individual coverage, health reimbursement arrangements, association health plans, and the short-term limited duration plans, things that Democrats hate and never would have allowed to be passed through Congress if they were in control. But a full Republican legislature could potentially do something like that. And absolutely, I would expect to see executive orders covering some of these things. And then prescription drug costs. Traditionally, Republicans have been defenders of big pharma, but President Trump is a populist, and he said before that the pharma companies get away with murder. I'm pretty sure that's a quote. But when he was in his first administration, they actually issued a white paper that listed dozens and dozens and dozens of proposals of ways to lower drug costs. And some of that's going to come back. I think he's also going to urge Congress to take action on some of the things that Congress has been working on in this space, which, by the way, many of those bills are Republican bills that have moved through either the Judiciary Committee. The Senate Budget Committee Chair Arrington has a wonderful bill that would help to lower drug costs. So there's a lot in that space that I think is going to be palatable that might have been a lot harder to do under divided government. On my next slide, I want to just touch on LAHA. That's not the subject of today's webinar, but just so you know, if RFK is confirmed as the Secretary of Health and Human Services, it's very likely that the focus will be on public health, right? They're not going to be focused on health insurance. They're not going to be out there saying, what can we do about mental health parity and cracking down on ghost networks and the kinds of things that the Biden administration has been interested in. They're going to be looking instead at, the revolving door between the Food and Drug Administration and Big Pharma. They're going to be looking at, vaccine safety and pharmaceutical clinical trials and the data that's required in order to get FDA approval. They're going to be looking at things like food additives and fluoridation in the water, things that could potentially have some kind of effect on people's overall health. So these are going to be the focus of what they're interested in. Doesn't mean that they're not going to be focused on what we want to do, but it's not going to be the number one priority, and it's not going to be grabbing all the headlines, which honestly might be a little bit useful. Maybe we can do some stuff under the radar and not have the eye of Sauron looking at us while we're trying to make some changes that could improve employer-sponsored health insurance. My last substantive slide is the next one. This is a prediction of the kinds of things that a Republican administration, and specifically a Trump administration, may look to do outside of Congress, just through executive action. So, for instance, on chronic disease, under the first Trump administration, they actually expanded what could be covered with first dollar coverage under a high deductible health plan. So, for instance, they said for the first time that treatment for chronic illness is actually preventive coverage, because if you don't treat it, it gets worse and you end up in the hospital. And that's why if you have an HDHP, you can have free insulin for your patients, is because of the changes that Trump made. And so we think that they'd be looking at more in that space and not just under HDHPs. I mentioned birth control because in the wake of the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision, there was kind of an edict that went out from the White House to every part of government, which was do everything you can to promote reproductive health, abortion, birth control, etc. And a lot of changes that have been made in this space are not in line with what a Republican administration would want to do. One of the most recent ones that you may have been following is that a new form of birth control is now available over the counter right? So it does not require a prescription. And the Biden administration said, you know what? Since it's over the counter, we're going to mandate that everybody cover it with first dollar coverage. Well, I would not be at all surprised if the Trump administration said, nope, we're tossing that executive order in the trash can. Also looking at those other types of health insurance to get around the Affordable Care Act. I mentioned them. I do think that the one that probably get the most attention is association health plans. You know, they did put out a rule on that in the first Trump administration, but it was generally considered lacking in certain respects. And then it spawned a ton of litigation, right? So there's total uncertainty for AHPs right now. I am sure that the Department of Labor will revisit that issue. On AI, it seems that the main thing that they might do with an executive order is just eliminate all the stuff that the Biden administration did on AI. So the Biden administration is somewhat AI skeptical, right? They believe that AI could use algorithms to discriminate against people, to violate, their standards for health equity, to auto deny people's claims and reimbursement, et cetera. I think that the Trump administration will just throw all of that out and said that, Elon Musk and the Doge said that that's a waste of time and money, and we're going to go back and just let a million flowers bloom. Government agency reorganization. Again, this is the Doge, right? They said that they are going to sunset themselves in 2026. But before that happens, they are going to probably create a massive report or a series of reports that say how every single agency and department in the federal government should be reformed, some of which they'll say should be scrapped, others which they'll say should be reorganized. I am sure that this will include HHS and the Department of Labor and the Treasury as well. They already said they're going to try to audit the IRS. It's going to be really, it'll be good TV, okay? Either way, unclear if Congress will act on those recommendations, but we do know that from an executive standpoint, there are things that the Trump administration will try to do to advance some of those proposals. Mental health parity, if that rule still exists by the time President Trump takes office, I think there's a very good chance that they will try to knock it out via executive action. Like I said, the tiny change that Congress made in requiring documentation for NQTLs is not statutory justification for the wholesale changes that have been made to mental health parity. Fun fact that folks may not know, if you look at the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act that essentially created the MHP regime that we have to follow today, you can read the whole bill, which I don't recommend. Nowhere in there will you find a term non-quantitative treatment limitation. In fact, NQTLs were debated in Congress. Congress decided not to include them in the bill, and then the Obama administration, who writes the rules, decided that they would create NQTLs. So I would not be surprised if there are challenges that go deeper than just the most recent rule. Maybe they even look at that original rule and say there was never statutory authority to do some of these things. So that's the end of my substantive slides. Happy to take any questions if there are any. And I also wanted to share my contact information and that of the ERIC team in case we can ever be helpful or of assistance.
Very sadly, we are out of time, so we won't be able to take additional questions. However, if you do have some, please send them our way. We will make sure they get answered, and we'll post any additional information, resources from our guests. But both of you have just given us probably a master class in a very short period of time on two aspects of the world that employers now face post-election, both what they face in terms of compliance with CAA currently, which is significant, and I really appreciate your comments, Amy, and very insightful advice. And certainly, James, you just gave us a breadth of information about what's going on here in Washington and where it's headed. So I personally have learned quite a bit from both of you today, so I really appreciate this. And again, for those of you watching today, more information is available. Go to our website. We will post resources, information, and if there are additional questions, I think there have been a couple, we will post some comments from in answer to those questions as well. So thank you all for being with us on Leapfrog CAA, continuing efforts to keep you updated so you are ahead of the game on being an employer who cares about your employees and their health, and does so in a way that drives Washington forward. How about that? We're going to drive them. So thank you all. Amy and James, thanks for being with us.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Leah.